Hi, I'm David Windsor, a journalist by trade, and as ever, I'm joined on the podcast by Mr. Unplugged, Hector Hughes. Each week, we explore the wonderful world of switching off in a world that is always on. And today, we're joined by Shafi Musaddique. Shafi's a journalist covering the Baltics and the Nordics for The Guardian, iPaper, and other publications. And today, we're going to be chatting about all things Estonia, where Shafi's based, and the Nordic culture of cabins and detaching from the big world of tech. So, Shafi, first of all, it's really good to have you here today, mate. Thanks for peeling yourself away from Tallinn and coming back to big bad London, where of course you've kind of lived your whole life. I mean, you're one of those rare breeds, like a genuine born and bred Londoner.
Yeah, you don't get many Londoners who are born and raised here and then like lived here basically all their lives, right? Most people who live in London have come from elsewhere, whether it's elsewhere in the UK or international. So yeah, London is deep in my veins. London Underground is my first memory. Like, you can't get more London than that.
What is that first memory out of interest?
It's the smell of the London. You know that musty smell.
Right.
I quite like it. I'm not gonna lie, guys. Like it's dirty.
First time I've ever heard of anything like the smell of the London Underground. So
yeah, of human sweat.
that should be the criteria for a proper Londoner. Yeah.
But yeah, like lived there all my life. Lived here all my life. Bar a stint in France in 2019, and I get this reason. Why did you leave? To, not France or Germany, but to the other side of Europe. It's quite radical. And like, I reached a bar during the pandemic, mentally, psychologically. I love London so much, but there is an addictive quality to London that can sometimes get out of control. And I don't think when we live in such a dynamic city, we don't realize what that addictive quality is. So it's like FOMO, or like feeling like you've got to go out every day and do something, and if you don't, then you're missing out. And there's constant stimulation, and that is a big reason as to why I left. And just general quality of life, having your own studio apartment that's affordable, and just I'm a big believer that everybody has to change their soil. We're a bit like plants. We've got to uproot ourselves and shake ourselves a bit once in a while. And I think for me, I think a lot of people might resonate with this point, but I was very much in my status quo of living, almost zombie-like. And it's a really big reason why I moved.
I mean, just for those who don't know, and I don't think I did know Shafi before you told me you were moving there. Where is Tallinn? Because it's right on the Russian border and kind of a stone's throw from Finland.
So it's not quite near the Russian border. So Estonia does border Russia. So you have the Baltic Sea, and you have Finland to the north, Baltic Sea in the middle, Estonia, and then underneath is Latvia and Lithuania, the Baltic nations. So Estonia, it's a crossroads culturally. It has Scandi culture, but it doesn't have the Nordic brand like Sweden. We think of Sweden, meatballs and ABBA. We think of Finland and, snow and the Moomins or whatever. Estonia doesn't have that branding, but it has that culture. And they're in a bit of a crossroads because they've had 30 years of capitalism. So you have this kind of market economy, but deeply ingrained is this Scandi culture. So I say to a lot of people, I live in a Scandi city, but on Polish prices.
Was Tallinn and Estonia, was that a conscious decision by you, or fulfilling a childhood dream? Or
I never thought I'd leave London. And when you're born and raised in London, you don't have to leave because everybody comes to you. Everybody in the world. You guys know you have every single community here available. So for me, I didn't have to go out. I didn't have to search for other people. And that was a real struggle as to the moving process. But in terms of why Estonia, long story short, digital nomad visas, a little bit of a loophole to Brexit. Essentially, if you're a remote worker, you can apply for these visas. It's very quick and short. Mine was 80 euros. 80 euros. Applications in English. Takes 10 minutes. You get your visa in 5 working days. I'm in. So it's more kind of a bureaucratic process in some ways. But yeah, it's also, being a journalist, you are a storyteller. So I'm in a culture that's completely different. And everyone's like, oh, why don't you go to Portugal or Spain? Lovely places. I know you're partial to a bit of sun yourself, Dave, but it's for me, it's something where you're not chasing the sun, you're chasing a quality of life, which I didn't have in London, which I have now in Estonia.
I mean, you mentioned that I mentioned that, you work for publications like The Guardian. You should read Shafi's stuff. It's a really interesting take on like that part of the world and how it influences around it. But how do you find, a lot of people move to London or big cities because everything's so plugged in, and as you said, like everyone comes to you, everything's around you, so the stimulus is there to kind of make things happen, or it certainly feels like the stimulus is there to make things happen. But somewhere like Tallinn, I don't know, population must be
400,000. That is
Right,
the
okay.
size of 2 London boroughs, probably.
Yeah.
It's not much, right? And you imagine going from a city of 10 million to that. It's complete sea change.
What was the big difference? Just the kind of the constant noise of the city, or
When I moved there, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. There is quiet and there's quiet. There's a quality to the quiet. I can't even describe it. It's within the people themselves. It can be quite melancholic in the winter. And I moved in February, right? -12, this much snow. Don't do that. Big mistake. Do not do that.
esoteric life advice: don't move
Yeah.
to Tallinn in February.
yeah. And it's not even the cold; it's the dark. You can't get yourself out of bed in the morning, and it's really penetrating, the dark. But in terms of the difference, you can hear the birds. You can hear yourself think. And as a creative person, both of you guys know this, as creative people, you need a foundation of silence to be able to be creative. Different countries have different souls. So like, I think those Nordic countries, the soul of those countries is in nature. Whereas somewhere like the UK or, Spain or whatever, the soul of those countries is in urban life. And that's something that's been a learning curve for me, has been understanding the soul of a country is in its quietness, which is really difficult at times, because, I'm a people person, and you do need a balance of movement and quietness. And that's something I'm still trying to figure out.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were actually just chatting before pod about how, cabins, such as the ones that Unplugged have, they're actually really prevalent in, Scandinavian culture. And I think even like Brits would immediately associate cabins in the countryside and in the wilderness with that part of the world. Whereas it's not necessarily the case for the UK. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily equate the UK with cabins, would you? I just thought that was really interesting, Shafi. Is it because everyone's got the money to have a cabin in the countryside, or just the countryside facilitates it, or it's just something that gets handed down through generations?
It's the opposite. It's not the building itself, it's the essence. So in the Nordic countries, in the summer, everybody goes to a summer retreat, which is, a cottage / cabin, but it represents, your grandfather, your grandmother. When people are kids, they'll have 3 months off in the summer, and their grandparents will look after them in the summer homes. So there's a familiarity, and because the climate dictates people's schedules there, right? You got to think about this. You have 6-7 months of bleak winter, thick snow, and you only have about 2 months max of good weather. So for people in the Nordics, the cabin is a retreat. It's a social retreat as it is as much a retreat from people. But there's so much space, right? It's an abundance of space. And that's something we don't really have here.
Yeah, it's interesting just how like everything here is just on autopilot. So you think about London compared to like Scandinavia. Like if you're getting however many feet of snow every winter, you got to plan your life around that, and it really brings you into the present moment.
Yeah.
Whereas London, we've got train strikes at the moment. The whole city goes nuts as soon as there's
Yeah.
some train strikes. People just can't deal with it at all.
Yeah, completely. And also, in those cultures, in the Nordic cultures, they have elements of ritual that they still do. I'm not talking about religious ritual. I'm talking about the sauna. for example. These are deeply embedded rituals, pagan in root, but they still very much really, really love those rituals. You know, on the weekend, on a Sunday, they'll all go to the sauna, they'll sweat it out. It's quite normal for them to be naked and talk to each other. That
You experienced all that yet, Shafi?
Not me.
Okay.
I mean, I've done a sauna, but in my shorts.
Have you changed since you moved?
Have I changed? That's a really good question. I think a little bit in terms of, as a Londoner, I never appreciated nature. Like Hampstead Heath was my nature.
Hampstead Heath's pretty good, to be fair. As far as it goes,
Pretty
as
good,
far
but
as parks
It's not really a forest, right? I mean, Dave's from the south coast, so it's like that doesn't compete. So, you know, it's nature wasn't in me, but now I've got an appreciation of. I've got a sandy beach 20 minutes away from me on the Baltic Sea.
Yeah, so when you're saying nature in Tallinn, like what does that look like? Is it very green as a city? You mentioned the sea. Like what is it?
You get
like?
a bus, a 5-minute bus from the centre, and you're within the Baltic Sea where there's sandy beaches. One of my favourite beaches is Pirita Beach, and basically it's a stretch of golden sand, and it immediately turns into a forest. It's incredible. It's such an underrated patch, but I think for me, we talk about connections a lot of the time. You move to a new country, you're seeking connections. It's not just human connection, it's connection with your surroundings. And that is what I wanted, and something I kind of missed in the UK, or didn't have in the UK.
And you mentioned before we started recording that you found Estonian people to have like a deep quiet inside themselves.
Yeah.
How have you're talking about being extroverted, talking a lot, like how have you found your interactions with the locals have gone?
They say, hi, how are you, Shafi? And you just like...
Oh my God. Guys, when I first moved, I went to the supermarket. And you do that thing, you go to the cashier and you're like, how are you? I did that there. And this Estonian grandmother looked at me like she was going to call the police. Like, it's just small talk's not a thing. It's when you go to a new country, you realise it's not just what people say, it's how they act. There is a deep reservation there, which I'm still trying to observe without being judgmental. And that's one thing I miss actually about the UK is here we've got diversity of ideas. I'm not talking about diversity of people. I'm talking about diversity in the way people think. Whereas pros and cons here, but an element to living there is that it can be quite monocultural. But that's the thing. You go to new places and you have to understand the mindset of people. It's not black or white.
I was going to ask you, Hector, before you set up Unplugged, presumably you had kind of a scope of cabin culture globally and in the UK and Europe, and was like the Scandinavian cabin culture, is that something you looked at and you thought, oh, that's interesting, we'd like to replicate that, or how did your kind of research and development before Unplugged happen, or was it just like, bang, we'll start?
No, it was even more than that. So we fundamentally didn't know anything about cabins. So we looked around for what's out there concept-wise. So I went to stay with a company in the US, went to stay with a company in Belgium, just kind of gauge a bit of what's going on. And then eventually we were like, look, we don't know anything about this, so let's find a Swedish company. So our first cabin was actually built by a Swedish company. We then brought the manufacturing over to the UK, but so it's very much ingrained in our cabins, the design. And I mean, even Estonia is a real cabin hub. You know, there's many. It's a very cool company called Hughes, which is like these glass cabins, and they're a big export from Estonia. So it's a place to watch. But yeah, it's really in the culture there. You know, it's like people just get it, and a lot of it is that the cabins are a means to an end, which is being in nature rather than the end itself.
Yeah, and they are deeply rooted in nature, and I think it might go back to their pagan roots. Whereas I feel like maybe in Western Europe, not just Britain, but I think Western Europe, we've lost a little bit of that connection. I think in our ancestral ways, or our connection to nature. I don't know what it is, but in that part of the world, they still value that.
It's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of what's worked so far. Is right. We've just taken that idea basically, which has obviously been done quite widely, and it's just getting people for us offline and also into nature, and that's it. It does the job for you, because if you walk through a forest, you do just get this kind of deep sense of calm. compared with walking down, Camden High Street. So it makes a big difference.
It's a different kind of vibe for sure. I mean, Shafi, you also, I think this summer you went to an Estonian, I'm basing this purely off your Instagram photos, but like you went to some Estonian festival that was in the middle of the forest.
Oh, yeah.
But I can't remember what you said it was called.
It was Midsummer.
Okay.
So Midsummer is a thing there, height of summer solstice. And basically everybody comes out. The whole population comes out their homes and they go into the countryside and they light these massive bonfires and kind of everyone dances around. And it's connected to this paganism that they have deeply in their culture, but it's a celebration of nature, of being grateful for what nature gives, I suppose. It's very Nordic. But it's really intense because the sun is... I opened my window 1 a.m. and the sun is still out there. I'm thinking, what on earth is going on?
It doesn't set in the summer.
It doesn't set.
There's a period of time where it barely sets.
It's on the horizon. So you open your window and you can still see the yellowness of the sun on the horizon. It's odd. There's an intensity, and I've said this a lot. It's like, I love summer in London. I think it's a great vibe here. But in the Nordics and the Baltics, there's a quality. I've never seen that colour blue before in the sky. It's what I'd call powdery blue. When people go to New Zealand, for example, they're like, oh my God, have you seen the sky? It's similar to that. It's intense.
There's something very Scandinavian. I read a really good book called Wintering, which is about basically going through winters in life, so going through grief, going through trauma. And it basically highlights this point that we are built to winter, and I think, again, we are, obviously the UK is a very seasonal country, but we may be a little bit more oblivious, but we're just going full out all of the time. But I feel like in Scandinavian culture, that they like embrace the darkness in the winter and the coziness, etc. And then likewise, summer, they really feel it more, and their whole culture is built around that.
That's it. They have rituals matter to them, and they celebrate every season. Whereas here, I feel like we just go flat out until Christmas. Then we've got like Christmas and Boxing Day, New Year, and then we're back on
Christmas, and you're back on it, and
and it's funny. Yeah. Okay. Before I moved, I thought the UK was quite seasonal. It's not. The UK is not a seasonal place. We're quite flat, actually. And maybe it's because climate change as well, we're kind of warming up. But there, the seasons are really distinct. And I think there's something fundamental in our humanity where you want to feel the changes of the season. You want to be able to note that time is passing and time is cyclical, which they still have, and it's quite beautiful.
Yeah, it's a good point about, like, today's October the 5th, and it could feasibly be June the 5th.
Yeah, I was shocked. I landed.
What is it? I don't know, 18, 20 degrees. Like, it's one of those days in the UK that is just, it could be any time.
But a lot of that is like a side effect of just how we're living nowadays, because, not to bang the unplugged drum too much, but, like, the signs are there if you look for it. And I actually feel like as people do find more peace and all of these things, then you do start to notice things like the seasons changing, and actually you get a lot out of that. So I do feel like it happens here, but it's not baked into the culture, especially a big city like London.
Yeah, it's a mindset, and I feel like British culture has Americanized within the last 15 years. Our work culture, people are overeating, people are overworking, we're hyperactive, and those are things that maybe I wasn't aware of until I was about to leave for Estonia, where I'd reached the pandemic. Everyone says the pandemic was a bit of a breaking point for them. And I feel like we've Americanized too much. I'm not talking about TV. I'm talking about the way we think, which is continuously on. And you know this as a journalist. You always kind of have to be switched on, and it's dangerous. It's really dangerous.
What's it like in Estonia? Because obviously you mentioned a lot of the balance in Estonia and the connection with nature and everything like that, but it's still like Tallinn still has like these big tech companies, right? Like Bolt, Wise, like they're out of Estonia. So
yeah,
how do you think people balance that? Like, I mean, they're still putting in an awful lot of hours.
It's an odd one. So yeah, you're right. Estonia has become a tech hub. I think it's got the highest amount of unicorns per capita in Europe. I think it's ranked 3rd in the world for the fastest growing tech sector in anywhere in the world. So it's really digitalized society. Actually, they've had e-voting in their general elections for 20 years. We're still doing it on paper. It's really deeply embedded, but they've got a balance of being connected and having high tech literacy, right? I think internet freedom. There was a poll that came out this week. Every year, there's a survey on internet freedom. Estonia ranks second for internet freedom. What that means is that most of the population has access to the internet plus digital literacy, second in the world. So you have this duality of they're really hyper connected, but going back to what we were saying, they have these rituals in their culture where they switch off. I go for a walk at 4 p.m. in Tallinn, and people on their bike, and they're going out for a hike with their kids in the forest. It's an interest. We talk about remote work, and actually, funnily enough, remote work hasn't really kicked off in Estonia. The reason why is they've already got the balance of their lifestyle. So in a way, they don't really need it. That's what the Estonians have said. It's like, yeah, we work, so we can switch off. So in a way, we don't really need remote working. It's for you guys that can't switch off.
And is that the same at these big tech unicorns, or do they adopt more of an American culture?
Yeah, so I went to Bolt's headquarters a couple of months ago. I kind of poked them. I was like, are you guys doing remote working? And they were like, actually, you've got everyone in the office, which was an odd thing for a big tech company to do. But they're like, look, we don't have a policy of 9 to 5. You can do whatever you want, but we need people in. And we can debate the pros and cons of that on another podcast. But there is a sense that they don't have a hyper-capitalist culture, I think. And that's the difference between having a tech sector and having a hyper-capitalist culture. They're actually two different things.
So why do you think there are so many unicorns there?
Being a small country, remember, it's a population of 1 million, guys. 1 million. We've got 10 million in London alone. They've got highly collaborative mindset. So in the Nordics, they work with Finland, they work with Sweden, and they've got a lot of investment in. Also, you have to remember, 1991, the Iron Curtain fell. So when it came to rebuilding the country, they didn't have to go through the pains that bigger Western European countries have had. They just skipped all that and they just went, okay, right, we're going to build from scratch, but we're going to do it quickly and efficiently. So that's helped them in some ways. It'll be interesting to see whether they'll inherit some of our Western European connectivity, hyper-connectivity. I'm not sure if they will, they might. But yeah, collaboration is key in their culture, and that has really helped them to develop a mindset we don't have in the UK of collaboration. And this goes back to the essence of unplugging, is I think in some ways, if you're on hyper-individualistic culture, you start to almost want to connect even more. I don't know if that makes sense or not. And then we've got this problem where we're almost so individualistic, we want to connect a bit too much because there's a vacuum in our lives, whereas over there, it's the other way around.
I think, Shafi, you
I
sell the
I'm
country,
talking
man.
like a philosopher here.
No, but you sell the country fantastically. Like, should definitely be on the tourism board and stuff like that. And actually, like, I'm in a WhatsApp group with Shafi where whenever there's like a good news story, I think I might have sent this to you. Like, for example, like Estonian air quality is like crazy good, isn't it? Compared
They're in
to
the
like
top 3 in the world.
I mean, I know the Nordics and the Baltics are like that generally.
Yeah.
But like Estonia is like right up there, which is something you don't notice. Like if you live in London, you never think about air quality. Well, I don't until you leave, and then it hits you like, oh, that's what clean air feels like.
Oh, when I moved, the first thing I noticed, I smelt the air. I was like, oh, there's a quality to the air here. You know, you can smell the leaves. Like, I can't describe it. I really can't, but it's odd. It's odd to say that the air is something to think about.
So could you see yourself from now like really embracing Estonian culture, or do you think you're always going to be a bit of a Londoner?
Oh, there's a conflict in me because I'm back here and I'm like, oh, the food is great. I can get any food in the world here. The art scene, you know, you go to museums, all these kind of things. And it's difficult because, you know, I'm 32 and my network is here still. You know, I'm still, when I'm in Estonia, most of my time on my phone and I'm messaging people back home. 99% of the people I know are back here or in Europe. So I'm on my phone a lot, messaging people. So it's a difficult one.
Sounds like you could do with a stay at and probably a second stay, Shafi, because you have stayed at Unplugged before.
I have, and it was funny because when I stayed in your cabin, it was February 2022, and the Ukraine war had just kicked off.
Oh wow!
And I had been asked by a publication I was working at the time to do a story. I think it was the first week of the Ukraine war, and I was like, okay, I've really got to switch off, but mentally I've got to do this story about Russian money in London. So like, actually, it was needed. That cabin came at a crisis time, and I needed it.
Yeah, we'll have to seek out that story.
But yeah, like, it's a big city, small city dynamic. It's a difficult one because I went to Stockholm a couple of weeks ago, and I absolutely loved it. And for me, that is like my ideal city, where you have enough people to have ideas, creative ideas, but to not have this hyperactivity. That's the balance.
How do you find that compared to Tallinn?
Oh, it made Tallinn look provincial. Like, it looked like a village. Tallinn looks like a village compared to someone at Stockholm. But there are elements of London that I now love that I didn't love until I left.
You were talking earlier about the quiet in Tallinn.
Yeah.
Is there an element of that still in Stockholm? Or?
Yeah, there is. There really is. But when we talk about quiet, there's almost a social conformity in Estonia that I've noticed, where I'm not a particularly loud person, but over there I feel like I'm loud. And there's this kind of a social pressure to be quiet, to almost restrict yourself. I think it comes from the Soviet era where, an Estonian told me this, they were like, in the Soviet era, if you laughed in public, somebody will come up to you and say, why are you laughing? What do you have to laugh about? What are you hiding? It's interesting how cultures are born and made and they're passed on down the generations.
Because I mean, that's basically how Americans see Brits, you know, like we're the reserve ones, and then we go to the Scandies, and it's a whole nother level. But yeah, I think there's something about history, you know, like even in the UK, we have the weight of history on our shoulders a lot more than the US, and that does make for a more reserved culture. Like you see a lot of kind of the European, but maybe it's just the North Europeans, so it might be something to do with the cold and dark as well. But
yeah, whenever I go there as well, whenever I've been there, like, it is hard to. There's so many great things about Scandinavia and that region, but like the word sterile does come up quite often. Maybe that's just like going from London to when I was in Stockholm. I thought, wow, like you can eat your food off the street. Everyone here has a beautiful life. Like all your friends have like a cabin or a countryside place. But like there is a feeling that it feels quite sterile. Everything was like a museum. Like you can't touch anything.
It's almost too perfect, isn't it?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, you know, obviously Sweden's got its own problems,
Does,
and like there's some interesting stories coming out of there at the moment. But yeah, from the outsider looking in, it feels like that.
I miss a bit of chaos, guys. That's the one thing in London. You know, when you turn the street and you're like, "Holy, what is going on here?" Like audible here. You don't get that in Tallinn. Everything is very linear, and that is one thing I miss. I also miss the infusion of different communities, like you get in London. Like you can meet anyone in the world here. Whereas over there, it's still quite monocultural, and it's a tricky one. It's just different histories. And
do people use their phone less there? Or do you think it's just because if there's so many, it's a smaller city. In theory, there's less like chaos. They're more connected with nature. You've got the fresh air quality, the balance of life. But ultimately, do you think that does translate to less use and reliance on screens and tech? I mean, I'm not asking for the statistics, but just like anecdotally what you see.
I don't think there's a correlation. There's a lot of things they do that don't make sense. So like the car usage is really high. I know it's not connected to phones, but there is a correlation where we talk about nature, the connection to nature, but there's so many cars. It's an odd dynamic. I don't know whether people are using their phones less there, but what is interesting is that because it's such a small population, everybody's connected to everybody. So when I got there, people were like, "You're one person away from the Prime Minister," and that actually came true. So basically, I went for a walk. This was back in June. I went for a walk in Tallinn, and then I bumped into this girl. She was like 23, so a young woman, outside Parliament. She was demonstrating. It turned out she was the youngest MP in the country. She's 23 years old. She was doing a demonstration about climate change. She just had a chat. Half an hour into this chat, she was like, "Do you want to come into Parliament? I'll show you around." That would never happen in the UK. People are like, "Oh, do you want to go into Westminster and I'll give you a tour?" And then we kept in touch. And then I did a piece on her the other day, in an interview where I met her in Parliament as well. And then she was like, do you want to chat to the Prime Minister? She's right there. I was like, okay. So I talked to the Prime Minister of Estonia spontaneously for 10 minutes. Again, you wouldn't bump into Rishi Sunak and just had a riff with him.
And you spoke about the quiet in Estonians. Was that true of the Prime Minister?
They have an efficiency to their words.
Yeah.
They use their words less. I don't know what it is, but there is a sort of a melancholic tone to even the way they talk. It's a difficult one because I'm somebody, as a journalist, you've got to read people's body language as much as what they say. But yeah, they're really connected as a people because there's so few of them, which is a real strong point. But getting into that society is difficult as well as an outsider because there's so little of them. But yeah, whether it impacts their phone usage, I don't really know. Yeah. But one thing they do is that in the summer, they take 2-3 months off.
Really?
Not everybody, but most people take 2-3 months off. It's astonishing. So when you talk about unplugging, it's deep in their culture.
Do they stay in Tallinn or do they?
No, everybody leaves.
Oh, interesting.
So you get this in Sweden and Finland as well. Everybody leaves the city and it's deserted in summer. And everyone's in their summer cottage. We think of a cottage as being quite fancy. It's not. It's really basic. There's probably no running electricity. I know you got your compost toilets in your cabins, which were, as a city boy, London boy, I was like, what is going on here? Good for nature though. I'll give you that. But that's what they have. That is essentially their culture. Yeah, it's fascinating.
So you're going to live there forever, Shafi?
Oh, I don't know, man. I don't know. It's I do miss my takeaways once in a while. We'll see. I mean, I'm really enjoying sampling Nordic culture. I think we've got a lot to learn from Nordic culture. But for me, it's more, I can see myself in Sweden or Denmark or the Netherlands, one of those countries. And I might come back home. I might, but I don't want to go too political, but there's a deterioration to the quality of life here that is pushing people out, and I hope that changes. Just not just materialistically, but psychologically. There's something deteriorating here that that makes me quite sad, actually, seeing as an outsider. And maybe you guys disagree, but maybe I'll be back. But right now, I'm enjoying it.
I think everyone's a harsh critic of their own country, right?
Yeah.
So it's and you I think you more have the right when you especially you're born and bred here. I take your kind of criticism of London more seriously than someone that's been here a couple of years, even though of course they can voice that. But yeah, very interesting.
Would you guys ever move to?
I still need to see where it is on the map, I think.
I'm still waiting for you to come.
Yeah. Have you been in that part of the world?
No, I actually had an invite to go and see these glass caverns in February when you moved out there.
Yeah.
But I didn't take them up, so I might do it next year. But I'd love to. Yeah, I think it's. I feel like as we're trying to build Unplugged now, you want to go to the extremes. You want to go to the Estonian winter and really experience that.
You're not going to find many places in the world where you have the extremities of climate. Not with climate change and places warming up, it's getting more difficult to find those places. And one other thing actually that I forgot to mention is there's not many European capital cities where you go for a walk at night and see the stars. So a couple of weeks ago, I went for a walk at 10 p.m. I looked up, I was like, oh my God, I can see the constellation here. Again, going back to air quality, and I was like, wow, okay, like this is something you're really grateful for. And then again, in London, light pollution.
No, you've got to go into the English countryside to see that.
Yeah.
Is that something with the cabins? Do you have any specific cabin, Hector, that's like more, that there's like less air pollution, that people comment more on the stars in the sky, or is it just across the board?
It's a good question. Haven't run the numbers. I mean, it's just a case of the further away from London you get, the better it gets. Yeah. But there's something very humbling about looking up at
because you're Welsh,
star in
I
the sky.
imagine, like
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And there's, I guess, yeah. I mean, it's difficult to recreate that starry sky, right? You can have all the cabin, you can have all of that, but you can't guarantee a starry sky. So yeah, maybe you should go into Lapland. You know, have those, what do you call it, the aurora green.
Yeah,
was it the aurora green skies?
Northern Lights.
Yeah, one for you to do sometime.
It's seeing the stars a proper starry night is so humbling as well. Yeah, it's kind of like the ocean, isn't it? I mean, everyone knows what that is instinctively. Like when you're faced with that kind of massive, massive sense of nature and how insignificant you are. But it hits you every time.
Yeah, like every human who's ever existed has looked up at basically the same stars, which is mad. Like it's hard to quite get your head around just how all of your problems are pretty insignificant next to like the sheer magnitude of.
Yeah, completely. And like, look, next door to, I mean, there's a war going on in that region. Like Russia's next door. There's so many problems, but I'm not saying this is going to solve global wars and problems, but you know, feeling like you're connected to something higher, you know, I'm not talking about religion necessarily, but I'm talking about a feeling that you have, a gut instinct, and that is what we need more of.
Yeah, we were talking about the Netflix documentary Blue Zones. I don't know whether you've watched that, Shafi, but it was very interesting how it's a Netflix documentary that focused on parts of the world where an unusual amount of people reach the age of 100, like centurions. You might have heard of, like, you know, there's a pocket of Japan and Italy and Greece, and one of the major takeaways was connection to religion, and you know, you can see why that is. You don't have to be a religious person to completely relate to what you just said about being connected to something higher.
Yeah, completely. And it's like, you know, sacred spaces, for example. I just came back from Sarajevo a couple of weeks ago, and my God, it's an incredible place. And one of the things that makes it incredible is the amount of sacred places where it's quiet. You go in, whether it's a mosque or a church or a synagogue, and you walk in and it's quiet and it's free, and you don't have to necessarily know people there. You can just go in, and I think that's what maybe we're lacking a little bit here, is this accessibility to spaces where you can just switch off and contemplate or reflect. We need more of that. I know people say, oh, you can go to an art gallery, or well, I was just like, no, Tate Modern doesn't cut it. Come on.
Some nice stuff in there at the moment, though, Shafi. I was actually there the other day. Yeah, no, they've actually, interestingly, in the Tate Modern, they've tried to replicate like the Starry Night. I don't know if you've been in this in the last like year, but they've got an exhibition that just tries to replicate that.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Well, not quite, because it is it's a poor imitation, but yeah.
I also think there's something like the calmest. I mean, I obviously do silent retreats, or you know, go and stay in our cabins, that kind of thing. I think the calmest I've been was I stopped drinking about 3.5 years ago after a decade of doing it pretty heavily, and the first New Year's Eve after I stopped drinking, I remember walking through, went some in central London, and like walking through Leicester Square was just chaos around me, and I was stone cold sober. Like there was just something so peaceful around that. So I mean, the point there is like you can find it anywhere, almost in the most unexpected of places. So I think, you know, it's more inside of you, and I think that the more you can quieten yourself, then the more the outside world.
Yeah, and it's also about having daily practices. I think, like, I grew up in a Muslim family, so like we were taught about prayer 5 times a day, and like I think a lot of practices, whether they're religious or spiritual, whatever you want to call it, there is something that binds them all. Is that there's a physical practice of prayer or reflection or meditating or yoga. I feel like we could learn a lot. That you don't necessarily have to believe God or whatever, but there's something that I think is really important there about practice.
Yeah, I mean, basically every trend that's come out of Silicon Valley in the last couple of decades, you know, yoga, meditation, fasting, you name it, religion's been doing for thousands of years.
Alcohol is also, I think that's an interesting point, because I don't drink. I don't think you drink as well. Like
no,
once in a blue moon.
Yeah, something like that.
And that's also the idea of stimulation. It's not just outside, it's inside as well, isn't it?